Great. So, my thought is because it's just really a few of us, we take a different tack and make it more personal. This is about having you walk away with something that made you glad you spent the time. Um, what if we just spend 1 minute on introductions? Because I'd rather this be a conversation than just a monologue. People tend to get more when they engage. So, Paul, can you give us 2 seconds on your background and kind of what you're working on now?
Sure. I had a lengthy career, professional career in the banking business, primarily corporate banking. And I retired about 12 years ago from that. And I've been doing primarily board work, some not for profit, some for profit. In the last couple of years, I've been doing some work with a couple of foundations, and most recently, a foundation that actually helps people develop tax efficient giving strategies. So, pretty appropriate for this conversation today.
Great. And Anna, a few bylines on you.
Sure. I'm the head of client education, excuse me, at Altair Advisors. And so I work with multi-generational families, a lot of times help some of whom still own and operate a business, some of whom have sold it, but often working with different generations to really improve their communications around issues involving wealth and wealth transfer.
Thanks. And Scott?
Yep. So I came up through kind of the finance, private equity side of the equation. I spent a decade at Ernst & Young, originally pounding out quality of earnings, which introduced me to the world of private equity, and spent a decade within private equity. And now in this third decade of my professional life, I'm on the advisory side, as well as still doing some direct investing, as well as still doing some other consultative work around finance, accounting, operational, and strategic type objectives.
Great. So we have a commercial banker, an investment banker, and a wealth manager, which are perfectly complementary.
Yep.
So it should be a good conversation. So get my controls back. So the plan today was touch base on three things. What's an ownership strategy? Let's talk about governance, and then let's talk about succession planning. And so ownership strategy is something you've all heard me talk about before. We have another guest joining us. And ownership strategy is real. Why do I own this business and what does it do for me? And so the questions I always pose people is, how do you want to live your life? What does financial security mean to you? What do you want your business legacy to be? Because that's important for entrepreneurs. And what do you want to do about the people who made you successful? And as I work with business owners, I always say it's about goals and processes. So goals is if we're at point A today, where's point B? Where are you trying to get to? Some people have a good idea of that. A lot of people aren't quite sure. And so we address that by building decision trees of here's all your options, and here's the pros and cons of all the options. Now let's walk through them. And then you get to pick the one that makes sense for you. Sometimes it's keep the business, sometimes it's sell it, sometimes it's financial for growth. It could be all kinds of things, but working through that decision tree is a key element of the work. The second is managing process. Once you decide what you want to do, it doesn't happen on its own. You don't hire someone for the job. You need to manage a process to get from A to B. Certainly if it's selling a business, that's a defined process, raising capital. If you want to keep the business and turn it over to your kids, that's a third way. But those are the things that go into what's my ownership strategy? Why do I own this asset? How does it improve my life? Is really the question I always like to pose. So let's do a couple quick case studies. A friend named Ryan ran a third generation machine shop, and he was thinking about turning it over to his 12-year-old son one day. And life was great, business was good. And then a public company called him out of the blue and offered him 9 times EBITDA. Unfortunately, he didn't know what an EBITDA was. And so I got a phone call, and we spent 4 or 5 months building that decision tree and working through all the branches. He didn't need the money, so to speak. He was happy working. He was only 47 years old. He really cared about his people. He didn't want his people to get hurt. And he wasn't quite sure, what does this do to the rest of my life? it was not something he had ever comprehended. He didn't even know how to deal with it. So we spent a couple months going through that. And after a long process, he said, you know what? It is the right thing to sell because there's risk in my business that I didn't fully appreciate. And, one or two customers walk away and I'm screwed. So we then went and we ran a process. We got the business sold. We put $75 million in his pocket. And usually the next day, people's heads spin after a transaction like this. But he called me and said, I've never been so calm in all my life. His family's secure. They have generational wealth. All of his guys were taken care of. Now he just has to go to the office and work. If they want to fire him, he doesn't really care anyway. So that one's a complete win. I've had several of those. On the other hand is my friend John, who's 80 years old, owns a third generation business, and likes to tinker, loves the business. But if anything happens to him, he's going to leave a mess for his wife and children, none of whom even know where the factory is, completely uninvolved. It's really a disaster. And I've been trying for 2.5 years to help John sell his business, but he'll talk about anything but selling the business. And that's a case where it's a failure of ownership strategy. He doesn't need money. He's got plenty of money, loves the business, loves to tinker, but it's just a mess waiting to happen. And so that's why on ownership strategy, the business is an asset. Why do you own it? What's it going to do for you? I always encourage owners to think through that. Certainly, if anybody here has a couple of points to add, that'd be great. Anna.
Yeah, one of the things you said that caught my attention that I've worked with a few clients on over the years, both here and I used to work at a group called the Family Office Exchange, and I saw it there too, was this issue of we want to sell, but we want our people to be secure. And that's hard. I rarely find a situation where that's worked out the way they've envisioned that it will work out. Like, I feel like you've either got to, like, I don't know if they still do it. So, but there used to be a group, McNally Capital, and they would work with owners who really wanted that as part of sort of their legacy. But I mean, they would also, that would also go into the pricing of the business, right? Like, we'll honor this stuff, but we're also, that's going to affect the premium of what you get. Kind of fair enough to a certain degree. But I mean, I have a client right now and they're working with this group, and it was all going to be, great and and they're not interested in keeping the same, like they're already starting to kind of chop things around. So, I think I've realized over time, like preparing people for the business that, you and, your spouse founded or whatever it is, like, it's not, once you sell, that won't be the same for your employees. Like, I think it's false to tell people like that'll remain. Like, that seems to be, I've seen a few people be very upset by that.
Absolutely true. So my friend John that I just mentioned has 2 key employees, and he's been reluctant to sell the business because he cares more about them than him. So there's a couple of tools that I recommend are pretty common. One is to incent your key people to help get the deal done. You give what we call a stay bonus. You take a piece of the proceeds and you allocate it to the people you have to get the transaction completed. Right. So that's one type of incentive. The other one, and we're doing this with my friend John, as I said, let's just pick a number. And we're going to tell them that we're going to give them this number as, something going forward. We can help them negotiate employment agreements, but absolutely, completely, 100% true. Once you sell control, it's not your business.
Right.
They're going to get a new boss, and the best thing they can do is to perform well, and they'll be fine. Politics are politics, and there's always innocent victims. We saw horrible cases of that when we sold the Werner company. But when we sold our business, we had 3,500 people, and we had some hard discussions on, once we cross this bridge, it's different. And a good example is the day after we sold the business, I had to show an ID to walk in the door. Okay, I'm just another employee.
Wow. Yeah. My husband worked for Crate and Barrel's corporate headquarters, and he was there when the Siegel family ran it. And luckily he was already gone, but they sold, and people had been there it was very common to have employees, not only in corporate, but in stores who had worked there for 30 years. And
Absolutely.
after the auto group took over, well, they didn't want 30-year salespeople they felt were making much more than they should be, which, so they cut a lot of lifetime staff, I would say, and I remember Dave getting calls from people who were really, they were really, that was a big change. So
Right.
those things
And part for those who choose to sell, preparing the ownership group, and kind of the few key insiders, preparing them for the emotional turmoil is a key part of the process.
Yep.
And holding hands along the way is important to getting a successful transaction. Scott's bought and sold lots of companies. I don't know if you've got any thoughts to share on this.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I'll answer your question directly, but when we talk to business owners and we talk about maximizing the outcome for their sale, like, really one of the first things we talk about is like planning, and it's oftentimes the most overlooked step, what you're saying, and oftentimes it can take years. You don't just kind of wake up and plan for it. Sometimes it's the progression of many years and different decisions. Kind of use the analogy of the branches and all that stuff. But then we really talk about in the context of 3 questions for business owners. Timing is key. So we talk about, like, is the business prepared to be sold? That's something people like us can help people answer pretty easily. Yep, it looks saleable. You have a good management team, good diversification of customers, all that kind of stuff. The second question we talk about with business owners is the market and the economy. Do you understand where the market and the economy are? It doesn't necessarily have to be good. You may still need to sell in a bad time, but do you understand that? And again, that's things people on this call can probably help sellers think about. But the third question, which I think, Bruce, is kind of where you're headed with a lot of this, is asking the business owner, are you ready to turn the keys over and start that next chapter of your life? And that's a question no one can answer for someone. You can help someone, you can provide context, you can provide examples, but you can never really help them answer that question. They have to come to that decision, like, yeah, my button's popped, I'm done, I'm ready to turn it over, I'm ready to kind of exit. So those are a lot of times the 3 questions. The easier ones are the first 2. Is the business saleable? Do you understand the market? But then, are you as a business owner ready? And then really it kind of migrates and talking about execution. This is really important, and you only have one chance at it. It'll be the biggest financial transaction. And so the last thing I'll say, and then I'll pause here for a minute, as it relates to execution, kind of the guidance and the way in which we talk about it with business owners is your business should almost always be in a state where it can be saleable. And the reason that's really important is not only such that when you want to sell, it's kind of already there, but if your business is already in a saleable state, generally as the business owner, it means you're probably less fatigued, you're less at your wit's end. The analogy we use is kind of like a lot of homeowners decide, oh, I'm going to sell my house, I'm going to fix my house up. Then they fix their house up and they decide, God, I really like my house fixed up. It's so much more pleasant to live here. It's enjoyable. The everything works well and it's aesthetically appeasing. And they decide to stay for a while because it's just easy to stay there at that point. And that's kind of similar to a business owner. If someone is not preparing to kind of continuously be in a state of sale, they're probably doing themselves a disservice and probably creating a lot more thrashing than they need to. But sorry, I said a lot there, Bruce. I tried to go fast so not to monopolize.
That's great. So 2 things there is, one is every day you're not selling your business, you're buying it back is a common phrase. And there's a phrase called life after the deal. How do you live after you get a big bucket of money and don't have to go to the office? Anna and I have had a number of conversations. I've done some writings on it. You can find that on Forbes. Anna also has a speaker she has brought in who's very talented, has written an excellent book. There's a whole body of work there that is underexplored. And the case studies I mentioned at the beginning, 2 or 3 guys who, you're 47 years old and you got $50 million in your pocket after tax. Everything's different. I have another client, we closed 1st of May, 35 million bucks. He's an Ironman triathlete, extremely driven. He will outswim any human. And he called me about 3 weeks after the deal and he said, I can't get any work done. I've got no motivation. his head's spinning as he's trying to process. And then he said, exactly like you told me it would be. Right. You're right on schedule. It's a process. So let's take it forward and talk about governance a little bit. So basic principles, governance is really intended to be the bridge between ownership and management, assuming that it's not the same person who owns and runs the company. In private companies, in fact, it's not that complicated. Most private companies, certainly under a few $100 million revenue, there's only 2 or 3 people who count, and they control everything. You know, there's advisory boards and fiduciary boards, very different. Duties of care, loyalty, and good faith, those are legal obligations as defined within the domicile state of incorporation. Delaware Chancery is certainly the benchmark for the rest of the country, but there's plenty of legal precedent on, well, what are your obligations as a fiduciary director? Because you can be sued. I always say that the 5 things a board works on are oversight, strategy, capital, management succession, and risk management. If the board's covering those things, they're doing a job. And each board is like a bespoke suit. It's only for one client. What works well for one board could be irrelevant to another board. This is what I call the governance roadmap. And it's kind of the how-to list of here's the things to go through when you think about what are your governance processes, what do you need, what kind of what are the market-based forces on governance. And so in a completely self-promotional comment, this is also the table of contents for my new book on governance that Devin is helping me to produce. It'll be out in September, October. I am happy to send you a free copy. I just need your USPS mailing address. When it comes out, I'll ship one to you. There are plenty of how-to books in the world of governance, many excellent ones. So I didn't think writing a how-to book would help the world at all. So I wrote a book about, well, if you're the owner, what are the things you need to think about when you think about, should I have a board and what does the board do for me? And so it's more introspective to help owners, you know, have a better run company, sleep better at night, have less risk, and get the help they need when they need it. So any questions on the governance piece? Certainly I've got case studies to share if you're looking for examples.
I have several clients I work with right now, Bruce, who I think, you know, they won't bring on a fiduciary board. I mean, it's a lot of times sort of an owner founder.
Sure.
You know, so
that's why we have
they're like, oh no, I
boards.
have a board. It's like, that's like your 4 best friends who tell you that you're doing a good job. You know, like that's not a board, you know, but they won't, you know, but they haven't moved. It's, I think, getting the original founder to move to a fiduciary board, even though that's what would be good for the rest of the family at this point, because maybe their children are in their 40s and 50s. But I don't know how you get that,
So there's an evolutionary process in board development. It starts with what I call a consulting board, which means it's your 3 golf buddies. You have lunch a little bit and you kind of touch on a few things, but there's no big impact. There's a junior advisory board, which is outsiders. It has a regular meeting structure, you know, 3-4 times a year, but the agenda is narrow. It doesn't talk about evaluating the CEO's performance. They don't cover compensation. They don't talk about capital structure. They talk about kind of key business issues on growth or sales strategy or supply chain, but nothing that kind of gets into the owner's shorts too much. And then a full advisory board, which is advisory, not fiduciary, and covers just about everything. May not cover comp, may not cover performance or performance for everyone but the owner. And so that's an evolutionary process. And what happens is, you know, it's a need-driven phenomena. When owners have an issue, they don't know what to do, then they reach out for help. If they feel like everything is going great and they're the massive universe, why would they bring somebody in? So it's a reaction to pain, and it's directly proportional to the size and complexity of the business. Under $25 or $30 million, very few businesses have functioning boards. They are likely very active in Vistage, which acts as their surrogate board, or EO or EOS. And those are great organizations for that functionality. I find consistently when companies hit 25 or 30 million, that's when they first start saying, do I need a board or not? Or, hey, I just need help. And it's a span of control issue, because just like you can only manage 6 or 7 direct reports historically, you can only do so much with the management team. Those few key people have a fixed set of life experiences. And when there's something new outside their experience, they're like deer in headlights. It doesn't matter how much money they make. And that's what drives the board process. Now, on Anna's last point, what I do consistently see is you don't have to sell your company to keep it in the family. You do need to have management succession and accountability to keep it in the family and not have a disaster. So I've worked with several families where we want to own it, but our kids are in their 40s and 50s. There's doctors and lawyers. They live in California. But why sell a perfectly good business? So we're going to bring in professional management and then have a fiduciary board to hold them accountable, so the fox isn't watching the hen house. And from the consulting board with golf buddies to a true fiduciary board, that's the evolutionary process. And when you talk to someone, you kind of feel like, where along that spectrum are they? What do they need? What can they stomach? We know how it plays out. That's not the question. The question is, how do we get them on the path and moving with some positive momentum?
Yeah. For firms, for family-owned businesses that do want, to sell in the future, I guess this is like for Scott or Paul or you, Bruce, too. Like, does it make them, more does it make more appealing if they have a board
more
in place?
Sellable if they have an effective board, because it implies business discipline and intellectual rigor, and being less emotionally driven, because there are outsiders. So if they're fiduciaries, and assuming they're true outsiders who are being hired for their expertise. As a buyer, you expect, their books and records ought to be in better shape. They ought to have more discipline about their strategy process. I mean, they just ought to have their act more together than the typical family business, which, family businesses kind of live in this vacuum when there's no outsiders, and they can go askew and think it's reality. And that's tough for buyers. So as a general rule, if there's true outsiders advising the board level, it will help the sale process and help manage the emotion to the sale process. We went through, actually it's a client Ann and I share, I can say that. I'd referred them in a couple of years ago. They needed some basic money management things, great family, been successful. They had 2 divisions, and I actually helped start their original board 5-6 years ago. It was 3 outsiders. They were trying to transition from first generation to second generation, and there were some issues between the family, and mom didn't like the son-in-law, and the usual things. And we actually got through that fine over time, and you could see the benefit of having outsiders. The business itself was healthy, and then they got an unexpected offer, and in January sold the business they did very well. And so advised on the process, and they came to the board because they had never been through this before, and it would be permanently life-changing. And their concern were their kids, because we're going to get a lot of money. How do we not screw up our kids? And so we did some work in that department. And this turned out to be the best outcome for everyone. It's really a Cinderella story. So the last piece is on succession planning. Not making a decision is a decision. My friend John, who I mentioned, has had no succession plan. He now admits he should have sold his business 20 years ago and screwed up by not doing it. He also has no succession. Something happens to him, I'm not sure who runs the plant tomorrow. Whether family private or public, succession planning is the biggest risk. And in public companies, CEO succession is the key issue of the board. I always divide succession planning between the business issues and the personal issues. And with family, it's worse. With private businesses, it's not that much different. It's really about setting priorities for where you want the business to go. And as with hiring any senior talent, it's the must-have versus the want-to-have. The decision on who the successor is tends to be more of, well, what can we live without? Because no candidate is perfect. So in the succession planning, I always say you have to start with the business strategy. Where do we want the business to be in 3 to 5 years? Or what's the skill set and experience we need for the person who's going to be running the business, whether it's CEO, VP of sales, CFO, any of the key spots. You've got to start with the answer and work backwards. And once you know what skill set you're going to need in 3 to 5 years, then you can say, well, let me look at my current team. Can I develop them to that point? If you can, that's great. If they're just never going to get there, you have to go outside, and then you go plan on that. But key downfall of any business is not having enough bench. Emergencies tend to solve themselves, is what I have found out. But that's a bad way to run a business. Paul, you've seen a lot of businesses from the banking side who've had changes. Do you have any experience around succession planning to share?
Yeah, I do. There was an interesting situation. A former client of mine at the bank, I joined their board, and the company was owned and operated by a family, and kind of the patriarch of the family, 82 years old, CEO, did all the weekly ads for this retailer. At the end of our first board meeting, asked the guys, can you tell us a little bit about your succession plan? He was enraged, and he says, what, are you trying to fire me in our first meeting? So we realized we never brought up succession planning, those words again, but it took about 18 months, and we kind of switched the conversation to legacy planning. And we actually were able to convince him there was value in having somebody that could step in, at least a plan. But it took us 18 months. And fortunately, that was good, because it was about 2 years later that sadly he came down with cancer and passed away. But I still remember that meeting, just the look in his face. Succession planning, you're trying to fire me already?
So that's a great example, tying back to my comment about junior advisory boards and things that are out of bounds to discuss with the outsiders. You just lived through that. Is that that CEO didn't want to deal with it. Fortunately, you were successful with it, is what it sounds like.
Well, and Bruce, we were a fiduciary board. This is a company that come out of bankruptcy. Their lenders required 3 independent directors. So we could have forced an issue, but we thought, we're not there to do that. And we changed the narrative, and he actually embraced it. But again, it was legacy planning, not succession planning.
It probably just
on how you package it.
Right. Yeah, he probably just. I think too, for a lot of founders that I've worked with, it panics them to think about retirement. They don't have, one question, Bruce and I talked about this last time. One question we ask people sometimes is, tell me about all the communities you're involved with outside of work. And then people just look at you with this blank stare. For a lot of people, they have not really invested in other parts of their life. So if you start talking to them about retirement or selling the company, they kind of, internally that causes them to panic.
And Anna and I are talking to a family where the family's going to retire. And the issue is they don't know where they're going to Anna's point. As I always say is, people aren't going to leave where they are unless they know and are excited about where they're going to. So, calmly said, if you think you might sell the business to retire, you need to start a couple years ahead, building a new life that you're excited about. The common phrase is for better or worse, but not for lunch. If you've been at the office 60 hours a week for 40 years and your spouse has built their own life, why are they going to give up their life just because you retire? I know a number of folks whose spouses came to them and said, one of two things going to happen. We're going to get divorced or you're going to go back to work because this isn't working for me. It's different flavors of the same thing, but those are very real issues.
Yeah, Bruce, if I could just pick up on that point quickly, and I'm kind of just being a dead horse, given that I think we're all saying that's important. But oftentimes when we talk to business owners, and I just pulled up while you're saying that, is like, we talk about if you're going to sell your business, have a business goal. At this point in time, I'm going to sell it's going to be $50 million, producing this much, my valuation will be in this range, blah, blah, blah. We say equally important, have a personal goal. And I'll just kind of read you kind of like a template of one we have, but it coincides or kind of augments everything both Anna and you just said. But like, here's an example of one, and we work with people to come up with these goals, and they sound so trite when you hear them. But to Anna's point, like, there's substance to people kind of having thought about this, so they don't have that anxiety when you talk about succession planning or exiting your business. But I will have prepared myself and my family to adjust and thrive in a post-transaction life. My business will no longer be my identity. I will spend time professionally advising and investing in companies in the technology sector, serving in a strategic capacity, helping those companies grow their enterprise value. My spouse and I will spend more meaningful time together, chipping away at our bucket list of life experiences. I will have adjusted my lifestyle such that I have the economic ability to sustain my current lifestyle and invest in other businesses without stressing about the fact that I've sold the goose. So that's just kind of one example. I think that's kind of just reiterating basically what you guys just said.
There's 4 questions to answer. What is my identity? What is my purpose? What about my financial security? And what's my social community? Those are kind of the 4 things you need to figure out. If you have those figured out, the rest kind of fills in. If you're missing one of those substantially, the wheels come off.
Bruce,
I like, Scott, that you bring people through that, though, that statement. I think that's really good because I think people they won't want to think about it sometimes. They kind of compartmentalize that. And I think that it needs to be part of how they think about the sale. And a lot of the private equity groups, they don't want to, they're not interested in getting involved in that emotional stuff. Like, they don't want to do that. So I think
the last thing they want.
That's the last thing. Yeah, exactly. Please don't do
They
that.
don't want you to leave the office if you're still under contract.
That's right.
Bruce, I do have a question for you and the group, and it's maybe akin to a little bit of the work I've been doing the last couple of years. We work with business owners, and it's really, when you mentioned business legacy, we're working with business owners that have a philanthropic legacy, or they want to have a philanthropic legacy. So our foundation is a 501c3. We're a donor advised fund sponsor, and we'll work with business owners. Once they determine they're thinking about selling the business, there's some tax efficient ways that they can do that using a donor advised fund, that they can reduce their taxes and then have money available for whatever their philanthropic interests are. And I'm just curious, Anna and John, I'm not sure what you do, and Bruce, in your discussions with owner, does the idea of philanthropy, does that come up in discussion very often?
So let me defer to Anna first, because I know the work her firm does. And then Scott, you can certainly chime in.
It does come up. And a lot of times what's happened is, I've seen this with several older couples, like they've done some philanthropic work and they've made some big donations, but now they want to put it more front and center because they're, selling, they're going to have more time and all this kind of thing. So a lot of times we'll work through, like, what do you want to do with your time? What do you want your donations to go to? Which issues are most important? So we'll sort of bring them through all these things and talking about as a couple. It's a lot of times funny, like, they're they think they're on the same page, but maybe they're really not. So sort of putting a strategy around their philanthropy, I think is helpful. But to be honest, the people who I think lean in that way are people who were already doing that beforehand. Like, philanthropy's already been important to them. I haven't seen it be a great replacement, for better or worse, for the people who didn't have that passion ahead of time, they can still donate, but they don't see it as quite, for the people who are sort of already involved, they're going to go more that way.
They're
For the
adding
people-
more zeros to what they wanted to do
Yeah.
anyway.
Yeah. And they want to be more strategic about it. Maybe they want to get to know different groups that are doing different things in a certain, service area. But for other people, it can be a little harder if that hasn't really been something that's been a front concern of theirs beforehand.
Scott, did you have a point there?
Well, I'll say no, but then I'll continue for a second in that it generally isn't a big topic of discussion for us. Our clients aren't oftentimes looking to us as their transactional or M&A advisor to really kind of coach them in sort of their post-life. What ends up happening more often than not is through the relationship of being their advisor, you begin to develop some personal level of relationship, and you may start to have some of these discussions. But I'd say I've been and my partners, we're pretty careful not to kind of get out in front of our skis. They'd rather speak to people like Anna about those things, their wealth managers, than they would us. So not a lot to add other than it doesn't enter my circle too often, other than just casually through some dinner conversations.
Yeah, and so it's my observation, it is evolutionary. If it tends not to start from zero, to Anna's point, it tends to scale up because they both have time and resources and the intellectual curiosity. They're well served if they develop a giving strategy.
Right.
What do we want to do and why, and how do we have impact, and how do we measure impact? We can write checks all day long. It doesn't mean it does anything. And there's a phenomenon, you write a bunch of checks and you feel a little empty because, like, other than give away money, what happened? People evolve in their giving strategy. So a giving strategy, an investment strategy to produce the money to give away, and then a disbursement policy. Given what the investment strategy ought to produce, how much are we going to give away? How do we balance cash flows? And then that circles back to the giving strategy, because if you need a budget of how much can you give away a year, then how do you allocate that budget across different causes? If you have multiple year gifts, if you're, that all comes together, and there is a whole field of work there. There's a lot of very good professionals who work in that area.
Yeah.
So with that, just mindful of the time, very thankful for everyone to join. Let's just go around the room for any last comments. Paul?
This has been helpful. The content is good, Bruce. You typically have really good content in the materials you send out. But I think importantly here, it was really good to meet Anna and you, Scott. And John, I didn't have a chance to hear much about yourself, but glad to make your acquaintance too.
Anna?
Yeah, I echo a lot of what Paul said. This was a lot of fun, Bruce. I like having these conversations, and Bruce knows I can call and ask him questions till the cows come home. And hoping to talk Bruce into working with one of our kind of more trickier clients right now. So this was fun to have this conversation. Oh, we got to start.
Scott?
That's me.
Yeah, I'll just I'll steal Anna's term there, and I'll echo what Paul said. Appreciate you putting these together. And yeah, this is my first one, and I'd like to do these things. I think they're very informative. They're helpful. It's a good way to make connections. There's a couple of things each of the people said that I'd like to follow up with. I don't know, Bruce, if you'd share contact information, but if there's any way to get that for either Anna or Paul or potentially John, but to Paul's point, we didn't get to hear much from John, that would be helpful.
Yeah, and so just out of respect for everyone, would not give away people's contact info without their permission. If you want other people's info, kind of let me know, and I'll triangulate it, but just being respectful.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Great. Anyway, and thank you to Devin. She slugged through another one. Thanks for everyone's time. I'll send out a recording. If you're interested in either the first book or the second book, let me know. Happy to send along a copy. And anything else I can do to help you, just give me a buzz. Have fun, folks. Be safe.
Thank you. Nice
Thanks,
meeting you guys.
everybody.
Thank you.